All right. Welcome to another episode of I forgot what I call this series, Learning with Hegel, on my Becoming a Techno Wizard YouTube channel. So, if you recall the last section, we were talking about like kind of metaphysics of this idea of being able to grasp and understand and explain the world from a philosophical lens. And Hegel was mentioning, which I love beautifully. I was talking about this all week, ever since I the last episode, of how some people try to explain the absolute through one lens, through a what he calls a monochromatic formulation, right? A kind of formulaic view of the world and say, oh, this is how the world works, and you have a cookie cutter, and as Sadler says, you have a cookie cutter, application of this lens, of this formula, you know, and that just was so beautiful to me because we see that all the time today. Um, for me, especially, I see that with things like supply and demand. The whole idea of viewing the world through an economic lens, of saying, "Oh yeah, it's just supply and demand," the market and all that other stuff. But then it doesn't explain like the everyday reality of everyday lives. And you have this idea that, oh, the rational consumer and this, that, and the other people, and it just so much of our world today is, especially in terms of capitalism, is kind of unfortunately misused and misunderstood because of this overreach of a capitalistic mindset. And I'm not one to. I talk about capitalism a lot, throughout my videos. It's not because I, anti-capitalist or anything like that. I might be, I don't know, but for me, it's more of an analyzing our current world type of situation, right? In which people love to, say capitalism is so great, but it's for some reason it doesn't explain why we have this gross inequality and all this other stuff, right? Um, and as people are trying to explain it, trying to understand it, trying to solve these problems that we have in our world, the folks that think that just supply and demand, explains everything, it kind of loses its rigor, loses the places where capitalism is good at, right? There are some pros to capitalism, but when we apply that to everything else, it becomes just a monochromatic, formulation, as Hegel says. At least that's how I look at it. But you can also apply this thing with things like physics and biology, where people say, "Oh, everything's a physics equation," which is a very interesting way of looking at the world. And they do have some interesting aspects of that. Like there are aspects of biology which can be explained through physics and things like that. But there are also a lot of experiences, that just can't adequately be described through a physics lens, right? And I think, unfortunately, we do that way too much in the 21st century, where we say, "Oh, we know so much about this one thing, and therefore we can explain everything else around it." Even if we do know a lot about physics or, you know, um, economy or economics or biology or culture, anything else. Like if you try to use that everywhere else too, it just you lose the sauce, right? And I think what I think Hegel's going to do is show that philosophy is a matter of kind of taking out, or rather applying rules to certain situations and then applying different rules to other situations, right? If you want to explain the world, everything that is, then you have to be adaptable, right? You have to be, dynamic with your definitions and with the ways in which you can understand everything. Not everything is the same. At least that's my current predictions of what Hegel is going to get into. But we'll see. This is all supposed to be just a preface. So let's go ahead and get into it. Just gonna play here. There we go.
Further, the living substance is being, which is in truth subject, or what is the same, is in truth actual only insofar as it is the movement of positing itself, or is the mediation of itself othering with itself.
Okay, so whenever we get started with this stuff, we got to slow down a little bit, and then we'll speed up later. So let's see. Further, the living substance, and again, substance, to my understanding, is what he refers to as the the richness, like the matter, the main stuff of life, right? The main stuff of our experiences, a substantial, fulfilling, some like fulfilling, right? Fulfilling understanding of the world or whatever is going on. Further, the living substance is being which is in truth subject. Subject is a capital S subject is like the main thing you're talking about, the main point you're trying to get across, the main experience you're trying to describe. At least that's how I think about this. Or what is the same is in truth actual only insofar as it is the movement of positing itself, or is a mediation of itself, othering with itself. That's a lot of itself there. That's okay. I'm not sure exactly what he's talking about here. Insofar as the movement of positing itself. Positing is like making an explanation. If I understand correctly, positing, like making an argument. Let's see if I'm correct there. Posit. Assume as a fact, put forward as a basis of argument. Yeah. Okay. So positing self, or is the mediation of its self-othering of its. Oh, maybe that's how he's breaking it. Or is the mediation of its self-othering with itself. So basically, like the othering, like when you say, oh, this is how something works, but this is like the other part. This is the alternative, right? This is a different way in which you can look at it. At least I think that's what he's getting to.
This substance is, as subject, pure, simple negativity, and is for this very reason the bifurcation of the simple. It is the doubling which sets up opposition, and then again the negation of this indifferent diversity and of its antithesis, the immediate simplicity.
Okay. What does it mean by this? The substance is, as subject, pure, simple negativity. The substance. I guess when you try to explain, when you try to use the fulfilling experience, goodness, I don't know what that shake was. When you try to use the fulfilling experience of the world as the subject, as a thing that you're trying to explain, right? When you're trying to, I guess that's another way of saying like the intuitive or the intuition, right? Because if you try to use experience as the explanation, then you're basically depending on intuition. You're saying there's no way to explain this except to experience it, which is it's a pure idea, but it could be a simple negativity in that you're not actually describing anything. You're not actually helping move along the consciousness in that way. At least maybe I had that wrong, but that's how I'm seeing that so far. And it's for this very reason the bifurcation of the simple. It is the doubling which sets up opposition. Like bifurcation is of course the separation. Like okay, you have two sides. You have this side and you have that side of the simple. So something that is straightforward is a doubling which sets up opposition. That's interesting. So I guess when you bifurcate, you kind of double it. When you say, okay, you have this side and this side, you're basically doubling it. Now you have two sides to look at. Now you have two enemies, right? You have two things that you're trying to struggle with to describe or to explain. And then again, the negation of this indifferent diversity and of its antithesis, the immediate simplicity. So yeah, that goes back to the last section where he was talking about the indifferent diversity, where if you try to explain everything from a formulaic lens and saying, oh, this is the only way that the world works, right? And you try to apply that to everything, it creates what he said. He said an empty diversity or something like that, or like it's not really diverse. It's not really a diverse way of viewing the world because you're just applying the same idea to every situation. So it's not true diversity. And I guess that's kind of what he's saying here. Again, it's indifferent diversity in this case. Interesting.
Only this self-restoring sameness, or this reflection in otherness within itself, not an original or immediate unity as such, is the true. It is the process of its own becoming, the circle that presupposes its end as its goal, having its end also as its beginning, and only by being worked out to its end is it actual.
Okay, so only this self-restoring sameness, or this reflection in otherness within itself, not an original or immediate unity as such, is the truth. So only the part where when you're able to explain something in such a way that it becomes self-evident again, right? Like, okay, you can't, if you're trying to explain, how a divine experience feels. If you just say, oh, you have to experience it, okay, that doesn't really bring you anywhere. You just say, oh, you have to experience it to know what I'm talking about. But if you say, okay, that divine experience was like this, it was like that, it was like the sunlight trickling through, and I think it comes from how the brain, works this, that, the way, and in another way, like, you begin to be able to explain, like, reflect what you just experienced. Again, I may be way off, but um, yeah, process of its own becoming, the circle that presupposes its end as its goal, having its end also as its beginning, and only by being worked out to its end is it actual. Goodness, that's interesting. So, like, going full around. If you're able to explain something to an extent where people can understand it, again, like, you just explained something in such a way that people thought it was indescribable, right? People would think, oh, the only way to understand this is to experience it. But then if you make people feel like they've experienced it just by explaining it, you've come full circle, right? So in that way, it becomes actual truth. It becomes actual. It becomes something that is real because you just show people that you didn't have to actually experience it to understand it. You were able to explain it. Again, I may be way off the mark here. It's interesting how that may happen, but we'll see. Let's see what Dr. Sedler says.
In section 17, as we've seen, Hegel insisted that we need to understand substance, and by this we're going to see he means the substance, as subject, as not being something inert, but rather as being something active, something dynamic. And then the question is, well, what does that really mean? How does this work? And that's what section 18 is leading us into. You see I've got a sort of schema up here on the board with a number of Hegel's terms. Before we go into that, what is this section complete?
I see it's lagging a lot on the stream. I'm not sure if other people are seeing that. I'm not sure if there's anything I can do for that. Performance mode. Oop. Oh, disable my preview, my playback. So let me see if I'm going to check on my device and see if it's smooth.
Completely focused on the question of truth. What is the truth of a substance, or of substance itself, of the substance? Truth is not going to be what he calls a primal or original. Focused on the question of truth. What is the truth of a substance, or of substance itself, of the substance?
I'm checking on my device. It seems decent. It's still a little choppy. Yeah, I don't know if this performance mode is making much of a difference.
I'm checking them. Further, the living substance is being, which is in truth subject.
It's just gonna be choppy, y'all. I'm sorry. I might just have to end this stream, maybe. I don't know. It's fine. Like, nobody's really watching. Just go with it. Let me back up a little bit though. Okay.
To that, what is this section completely focused on? The question of truth. What is the truth of a substance, or of substance itself, of the substance? Truth is not going to be what he calls a primal or original or simple unity. That doesn't mean that it's going to lack unity altogether, but what it means is we need to rethink what unity, what actually being one thing, means. And
Okay.
here we're grappling with terms that are quite difficult. They may seem to be very simple to you until you start thinking about them. They're sort of like Augustine when he talks about, before somebody asks me what time is, I know perfectly well what it is. As soon as somebody asks me about it, now I'm not quite so sure. It becomes murkier and murkier upon analysis. It works the same way with terms like truth or unity. These are actually what in medieval theology and philosophy they call the transcendentals. And Hegel is grappling with these sorts of things. What is the truth? What is the true? What is truth per se? What is unity? What is being? What is goodness? And there's proposals to have other things as transcendentals. That's a whole different conversation. But I think that's important to bring up here at the start. So Hegel says the truth of substance is that it's also a subject. And what does that really mean? That means that it exists, or it has its being in what he calls positing, setting forth. This is what we call a thesis.
Name was the arguments, right?
Setting forth itself. That is to say that it's actively pushing itself out into reality. It's not just something sitting there inert. So he says, it is in truth actual only insofar it is the movement of positing itself, or is the, here he brings up another term, mediation of its self-othering with itself. So what that means is that for a subject or a substance, whichever way we want to look at it, the way it puts itself forward is as itself, and yet at the same time as something other than itself, as something different from itself. And you might say, what is it, like splitting into two? In a certain way it is, and we'll talk about that. But this is a splitting in two that takes place within the thing itself, within its own movement. It becomes other to itself, and only by doing so can it actually be fully what it is supposed to be. Only in this way does it have the possibility of dynamism, of activity. If we want to look ahead to a few other paragraphs that are coming up, of purposive activity, of rationality. All of these things for Hegel require that it undergo what he calls mediation. In German, this is Vermittlung. So when you see this term media, think middle. Also think, as we're going to see in another very important paragraph later on, also think the medium in which something takes place. But think middle term, like the middle term of an argument or syllogism as well. Think about what it was that was originally intended to do, which is to connect up two things which are not the same and bring them into relation to each other. Mediation is going to be a key concept for Hegel, and going ahead a few paragraphs, we're going to look at that in a bit more detail. Here he's just sort of naming it, introducing it. So he says the substance is as subject. So if we're talking about this kind of being, this mode of being, as subject, he says, it is pure simple negativity. Now there's nothing simple about this negativity, because what does it mean to negate? It means to say no. It means to say there's something else. It means to say not that. So already there is othering or alterity involved in negation. And so it puts itself forward, and yet at the same time also negates itself without losing itself, without just vanishing, without disappearing. So it's doing two things at the same time. It's becoming complex. So he says, it is for this very reason the bifurcation of the simple. What's simple splits. And, if we want to use a very simple schema here, I understand simple is a little bit of a pun. You've got what's being posited, and then you have what is being put forth as no, as something other, as something else, which is a negation of that. That's why he talks in terms of antithesis here. So he says, it's the doubling which sets up opposition, and then again, the negation of this indifferent diversity in its antithesis. Now, what he means by antithesis there is you have a positing, so a thesis, then you have something else, and then you have the antithesis between them. So perhaps I should put this on the board, because a lot of times...
So I was getting like this wrong. I was completely off the mark with what I was thinking about this. And I guess that's also the kind of the problem of viewing this in a week by week basis, and it's so far apart from the last time I read this. I'm constantly bringing my own ideas to the table and all this other stuff. But I honestly think that also makes it a little bit more interesting, right? Because you could read this yourself. You could just try to read page by page, section by section, and try to understand what Hegel was talking about. But when you also try to, interpret it in your own way, right? You can bring other ideas to the table, and find other relationships to it. Although I must admit, like in doing so, my interpretations are by no means what Hegel intended. Right? I know that for a fact. Not for a fact. Like I think sometimes when I make an interpretation, I say, okay, maybe this is what he was thinking. But when I'm wrong, I have to admit, okay, I was probably wrong with that. However, I think that making your own interpretation allows me to be creative with it. Right? It's like doing art a little bit. Right? When you see something that somebody created, or you see some random thing out there, then you just find new ways of doing stuff with it, right? New ways of bringing it together to create a whole new art form, or to create a whole new invention or something like that. Even though wasn't the intention, or it's not really the purpose of that thing, by reinterpreting it, you can get more value out of it than anybody ever intended. But it is a kind of what he's saying here. It's a bifurcation. Is realizing that my interpretations are not accurate, but they can be valuable, right? Ow! I just hit my elbow. So they're not accurate, but they can be valuable. At least I think so. I might be wrong once again, but this is why I enjoy doing this sort of thing, and I hope other folks will enjoy the same thing. I'd love to hear in the comments when folks listen back to this or watch this again. It's like, what are some of your interpretations when you were reading this the first time? When you read this series, if you ever read this book yourself, I would love to know what your interpretations are. And if you are rereading this with Dr. Sadler here or with me, what are some of your new interpretations, and how is that differing from mine, from his, from what you gathered on your own? I would love to hear that. Oh, we got somebody in the comments. Hey, Zach, so glad to see you here, man. It's so been awesome. The book, How to Read a Book by Adler and Van Doren, speaks about this. Ooh, of course there's a book about it. I'll check it out. It helps you develop a much deeper understanding and improves your thinking on the subject. Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I add that to my list. Let me copy that over, put it in my notes. But yeah, of course there's a book about it. There's a book about everything these days. But I think that's super cool, because it's just interesting that it's inevitable that happens, right? And that's kind of like the limitations of writing. I think I may have mentioned that in one of my podcasts or newsletters. I don't recall, but if not, I will definitely write about it, because I think it's important to realize that the very act of writing something down inherently divorces you from the perfection of interpretation, right? You have an immediate what do you call it, signal loss, like compression, like when you're doing a compression algorithm, right? When you first put the information out there, it's fresh or whatever, but as soon as you compress it, as soon as you try to send it to someone else, it's already losing some of that information, right? And we can see that as a bad thing. We can say, oh, every time you send it, it loses a bit of information, and therefore, that's terrible, right? That sucks. But it also gives you an opportunity to see it in a new way, right? And that's like the magic of the human mind. That's the magic of creativity. is that when you, even if something is so decompressed or so, not decompressed, so, what we call the word, just reinterpreted so many times to which the original message is not really clear anymore. The fact that you can reinterpret it completely and get something completely different is actually pretty cool, right? Because that means that you can you can inspire people to think in new ways without ever even knowing that it's possible to do that, right? Like if I, like, this message, this video, in 100 years, if somebody one day, stumbles upon this thing and it's been, compressed and decompressed and all this other stuff, and maybe they're talking differently, or maybe in 1,000 years, right? People are talking differently, or the machine messes up the algorithm and doesn't, get all the bits right, and so much of what I'm saying is completely, messed up. You know, they could get some information from that. Still, it won't be anywhere that I intended, but they might get a piece of information that can inspire them to do something amazing, or they might get something that might completely misinterpret and lead them the wrong way. That's a risk too. But the fact is that it's just amazing how information can be conveyed even when we don't really think about it in that way. And this is a huge tangent, but I think this is part of the process of engaging in philosophy and having that dialectic. But anyways, thanks for the comments, Zach. Thanks for the recommendation on that book. Come on.
People get this idea that Hegel is all about this triadic structure that's the same in every case, where you have thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and that these are always identifiable. So we have our subject, substance, and we have positing or thesis. And at the same time, we have a negation of that. We have the other, which is also being put forward at the same time as what this substance is. These are different from each other. Now, between these, we have an antithesis. We have a being set at odds with each other. That's literally what antithesis means. So, what is going on here? The subject is also, at the same time, overcoming that very antithesis of saying, yeah, you just have these two things that are sort of arbitrarily connected with each other, and they're different, and that's it. And it's saying, no, the difference here really matters. This is something that has to be explored, something that has to be worked out.
Yeah,
and so he goes on and he says, only the self-restoring sameness, this entire process, self-restoring sameness. This is where, if you want to, bring up Hegelian terms, you could say synthesis is actually taking place. Only this is the true. The true is not something simple. The true is something that is complex. That means it's not just composed of a bunch of symbols, into some sort of complex, but rather is the relation between all of these moments within this process. That is what truth is. So he says it's the process of its own becoming, the circle that presupposes its end as its goal, having as its end also as its beginning, and only by being worked out fully does it become fully actual. Now, that's where the paragraph ends. I think one of the things that you want to keep in mind as you're reading through this is that terms like actual, like true, have a certain kind of relativity to them. Not a relativism, but a certain kind of relativity to what stage in the process we're currently looking at each phase in the phenomenology. So when he says that only by going through this process of reintegration does truth really become actual, he's not saying that there's no actuality before that, no reality, no Wirklichkeit. He is saying that you have something new, something greater, something that's more true, something that's more actual coming on the scene. And it's not something that was totally new in the sense of not being there at all. It just wasn't worked out fully.
Mm. And I forget too, like the whole point of this preface is to kind of show that there is no way to do a good preface. And so what he's doing is setting us up. He's setting us up to be able to think about what his actual, kind of argument is. This whole phenomenology is like he's setting up the tools and the environment for us to begin thinking in the way that he wants us to think, or at least begin, I guess, gaining the tools to grapple with the ideas that he's going to put forward. So this is all, a whole setup process is pretty interesting.
Thus, the life of God and divine cognition may well be spoken as a disporting of love with itself. But this idea sinks into mere edification and even insipidity if it lacks the seriousness, the suffering, the patience, and the labor of the negative.
Let me look that up. Insipidity. It's like iniquity right there. Let me see. Quality of being drab or boring. Wow. Insipidity. That's a good word. I'm gonna have to remember that one. But yeah, I like that idea, or I can understand that idea. Thus, the life of God in divine cognition may well be spoken of as a disporting of love with itself. But this idea sinks into mere edification and even insipidity if it lacks the seriousness, the suffering, the patience, and the labor of the negative. It's like, the whole idea of having to keep the faith and all this other stuff is kind of empty if you don't also consider, you know, if not, like if you don't consider, being faithless, if you don't consider, what life will be like if you're wrong or if you're, this other thing is true, right? If you don't ever consider the opposite side of the coin, then you kind of just, it's an empty feeling, right? Um, it's not a real comprehension. And I think that's what he's getting to here. And I definitely definitely understand it. We see it all the time, right? People see just one side and say, "Oh yeah, that explains everything." But if you don't ever consider the other side or what that looks like or what their arguments are, or what if your arguments are wrong, then it makes it really difficult for you to truly be able to put forth a comprehensive understanding of the world,
Seriousness,
or even
the
your
suffering,
argument.
the patience, and the labor of the negative. In itself, that life is indeed one of untroubled equality and unity with itself, for which otherness and alienation and the overcoming of alienation are not serious matters. But this in itself an abstract universality, in which the nature of the divine life to be for itself, and so too the self-movement of the form, are altogether left out of account. If the form is altogether left out.
This in itself is abstract universality, in which the nature of the divine life to be for itself, and so too the self-movement of the form, are altogether left out of account. So yeah, if it's not like a total idea, right? If it's not a comprehensive idea, I like to use that word. It's very, kind of explains this. But if it's not a comprehensive thing, it's not really. Is it really bringing you in the direction that you need to go to understand the full truth, to understand the full idea of it?
Out of account. If the form is declared to be the same as the essence, then it is ipso facto a mistake to suppose that cognition can be satisfied with the in itself or the essence, but can get along without the form. That the absolute principle or absolute intuition makes the working out of the former or the development of the latter superfluous.
Whoa. So if the form is declared to be the same as the essence, then it is ipso facto a mistake. It is therefore, a mistake to suppose that cognition can be satisfied with the in itself if it just explains itself, without really the why or the what if you're wrong, then it becomes kind of empty. Like I said before, it doesn't have that, I guess what he calls it, without the form. That the absolute principle or absolute intuition makes the working out of the former or the development of the latter superfluous. I guess he's talking about intuition, absolute principle or absolute intuition makes the working out of the former, or the development, the former as in the principle, and or the development of the latter, which is the intuition, superfluous. So if you don't do all that work to make it meaningful, to really get a comprehensive, good understanding of everything, then the whole process or the whole, argument that you're putting forth is kind of superfluous. It's kind of meaningless. It doesn't really matter.
Just because the form is as essential to the essence as the essence is to itself. The divine essence is not to be conceived and expressed merely as essence, that is, as immediate substance or pure self-contemplation of the divine, but likewise as the form, and in the whole wealth of the developed form. Only then is it conceived and expressed as an actuality.
Mm. And back then they had a whole idea of the essence of things and try to explain the
Paragraph
essence
19
of
is another one of those
stuff.
famous passages that contains what you might call a Hegelian catchphrase, that is the discussion of the seriousness, the suffering, the patience, and the labor of the negative. What's all that about? So he starts out by saying that the life of God, so we're talking about the divine substance, that which is most real, the life of God, divine cognition, the process of God thinking, God coming to know things, can be understood as love disporting with itself, a play of love with itself. It's called love squared.
Love squared. Like
and he says, that's not a bad idea. That's not a bad conception for understanding what I'm talking about. But it's going to sink into mere edification. You remember edification is always a bad thing for Hegel. And even being insipid, being tasteless, actually lacking wisdom too, because there's, if you look at the Latinate connection, if it lacks the seriousness, the suffering, the patience, and the labor of the negative. Now, those are not things that you would normally attribute to the divine, except for maybe the seriousness, the suffering, the patience, the labor. God is, completely omnipotent, if we're thinking about, traditional Jewish, Christian, Muslim conceptions of God. So why would God have to suffer? Why would God have to labor? Now with Christianity, it gets a little bit different, right? And you have people engaging in reflections of why God became man, like St. Anselm. I'm going to set that aside for the moment. Why is negativity important? So Hegel talks about the in itself. In itself, God, or the divine substance that's also subject, is rather static. Everything is just fine. It's just sort of like a picture play, you might say. It says, lacking this negative, that life is one of untroubled equality and unity with itself. It's got this sort of relation to itself that just repeats over and over again. Nothing changes. It's all just great. But what's really needed is an engagement with otherness and alienation. Now,
so before we even get into this, I want to play around with this idea, because I think I'm getting more. Because recently I've been getting more into all the sort of philosophical things, and there's this one video I think by Vsauce. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's Vsauce, where he says, is a chair a chair? When is a chair a chair? When is it not a chair? Right? It seems like one of those silly ideas and one of those whatever, a word is a word, kind of pedantic kind of stuff. But when he broke it down, it began to show me like this very idea. Like when you begin to alienate an idea, you can get into the depths of that. So for instance, in his argument, he was saying, or while he was talking about the video, or throughout the video, he was saying that it seems like a chair is pretty simple. Then you say, okay, what is a chair? Is it anything that you sit on? In which when does a bed become does a bed become a chair because you sit on it? What makes a chair? Does it have to have legs? What if it's what if it doesn't have legs? It becomes a bench or something like that. Is that still a chair? Or is it not? It goes down a line like this, right? And then that, which goes into kind of some sort of ontology, topology, stuff like that. But it also goes into like this idea of the essence. Like, okay, what makes a chair a thing? Is it the essence of a chair? Is it the intention of a thing? Like, if you design a chair but you can't sit on it, like if it's just an artistic thing, right? Then is it still a chair if nobody can sit on it? Like, is it, you know, is it just a chair because somebody called it a chair, or is it because of the function of the thing, right? And if you look at it from a physical, physics standpoint, when does it not become a chair? Like, if you remove atoms from the chair, right? At what point does a chair not become a chair? At which atom, that you move does not become a chair? And again, it seems like a super simple, kind of almost silly, dumb idea, but it's a serious type of thing because, um, especially once we're getting with the technology to be able to create things on the molecular atomic level, right? You have to seriously ask these things for legal reasons, or for physics reasons, or for this, that, and the other. Philosophically, it's just interesting to think about the fact that that's the same idea with human bodies. The fact that every day a part of your cells and your the cells in your body leaves, and by the time every 10 years or so, almost all of your cells in your entire body has been exchanged. So at what point did you change from being you to being someone else? Like, did you ever change? You probably haven't. Like, obviously, you probably feel the same as you have when you were born, or when you gain these memories. But the fact is, every single cell in your body gets exchanged, pretty much, throughout your lifetime. And so, at which point, what makes you you? Is it the cells in your body? Because even the cells in your brain, those move too, right? So what makes you you seems to be some network, right? It doesn't seem to be the individual cells. It seems to be the network of things, and the memories and all this other stuff. And so that's inevitable. That's inherently more ambiguous of an idea of self and objects and things than we would like to think. We like to think a chair is a chair, a person is a person, but in reality, life doesn't care. Reality doesn't care for how simple we think it is. It just is, and it's our understanding, our perception of the world, in which allows us to understand more and more of what reality is. And that's why we do these things. That's why we think on this level, to try and get a better understanding of what reality is. If we think it's just simple, if we think it's just a chair is a chair, a body is a body, then when all the atoms leave, then you're seriously caught up with, like, oh man, what I thought was a body wasn't actually the same body. If I say I'm not the same person as I was before, are you? you know, um, but the whole point of all that, what I was saying there, is because of this, right? It's like, if you just say a chair is a chair, then you're just constantly, you're not actually learning anything, you're not going anywhere. But if you begin to, play devil's advocate a little bit, if you begin to alienate the chair, like, okay, what is a chair? What is not a chair, right? Then you begin to play that otherness, that alienation game, and you can understand and go to a deeper level of what is the chair. And by doing so, you can then, maybe if you want to create simulations, then you can better determine, how many atoms make up a chair, or what's the different ways in which you can simulate a chair in that game. Or if you're making, um, if you're trying to create a new technology to make real life holograms, or 3D print things and stuff like that, or even just philosophically talk about these things, because we see making categories as important. To say, okay, this is a chair, this is a table, this is um, a bed, things like that. And if you have a better, deeper understanding of what is a chair, then you can have a better argument for why this thing that doesn't have legs, or is not doesn't look like a chair, might still be a chair because of this, that, and the other, right? There's always going to be edge cases, and there's always going to be some interesting reasons as to why something matters. And that video went way more into depth. I am definitely missing a lot more other stuff that goes into it. So check out that Vsauce video, but that just reminds me or this reminds me of that. So it's pretty cool.
The very notion that this is on the scene shows you that this can't be the whole show. Otherness, this becoming other that we saw in the last paragraph, going beyond that, alienation. Alienation means becoming other to oneself, realizing that one is not what one thought one is, that one is, anguishedly split over things. We saw this talked about a little bit earlier with those passages about the new age that we're in, where spirit has come to realize that it's lost touch with itself. If all you have is this play of love or God or knowledge or whatever it is with itself over and over again, then this stuff doesn't really matter. But the fact that this is actually there at all means that it does matter. And that over here we're kind of hiding from reality, hiding from ourselves. And really what has to happen is this movement of self-othering, of reflection into self, of splitting, of alienation. And then there has to be, only on that basis, can there be, an overcoming, a sublation, a
full circle.
Sublimation of this alienation. Only after you've actually acknowledged it, think about any given problem, only after you acknowledge that there's a real problem there can you actually grapple with the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Can you actually see it for what it is? Can you actually feel its weight and start to sound its depths? So he says this in itself is abstract. That's the problem. It's abstract universality. But the nature of the divine is to be for itself. The nature of any subject, of anything that actually thinks, anything that knows, that takes a position, is, well, at least at a certain level of reflexivity, is to be for itself, to be able to take a position on itself. And in doing so, beings often find out that they aren't what they thought they were in the first place, that there is otherness, there is alienation taking place, that expectations are not met and have to be rethought, and then there has to be a process of reworking this. So he talks about this as the nature of divine life, because think about it, if it's God, if it's the absolute really needs to be everything that it can be. So the self-movement of the form gets left out of account. Now, why does this matter? Well, Hegel is going to talk about something else at this point. He's going to leave this notion of form on the table, so to speak, and he's going to explore the relationship between form and essence. Normally, let's start with essence. Normally, when we think about the essence of a thing, we think about what it is that makes that thing that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a tendency to think of essences as sort of static conceptions that we can grasp, and then, we've got some sort of copy of that in our head, or, there may be other relations in which we think about our knowledge of it. But we grasp the essence. If we're really lucky, we can actually come up with a definition that expresses the essence, and that definition better not change over time, better stay the same, and the essence better stay the same over time. Hegel is actually critiquing that very notion. He's not just saying, too, by the way, well, why can't it change over time? He's actually saying it does change. There's a process involved. So he'll actually talk about what's essential to the essence.
Essential to the essence. That's an interesting phrase right there.
This may throw you. You can say, well, essence isn't the sort of thing which can actually be squared, which can be taken to a higher power. But why not? If we're doing metaphysics, we can actually say, okay, you've got essences out there. What's actually essential to essences, or to the notion, or the being of essence itself? What's essential to that? And for Hegel, the answer is actually that it has a form, that it is dynamic, that it is developing, that it has a history, that it has a before and after, that it has a process of becoming other, and then recovery of that. So he says...
So I know he's going to get into it, but this is exciting to me. So he's basically breaking it down, right? Like the idea that an idea or an essence of a thing, when you're trying to explain a thing, it can't just be that thing. Because if it is just that thing, then how can you say, like, how does that square, or how does that match with the idea that the world is ever changing? There's literally nothing that stays the same throughout, all time and space. Maybe he's not bringing that approach to it, but the fact is, things change and our ideas of things change. Like the idea of color, for instance. Like people didn't have an idea of blue, of the color blue before. They knew that the sky was this color, but they didn't call it blue, right? That that word and that idea came from some other things, and in the future, maybe that idea will change further, right? So even some things that we think is clear is clearly this thing, this idea, is changing, is ever shifting, and so what he seems to be saying here is like the essence of the essence of the essence, the essential of the essence is that is dynamic. It's ever changing. Like there's a process to it. There was something else before. Now it's this thing that we know and we think about, and then it will probably be something else later, right? And in that process, you can get a better understanding of what that thing is, because it's like a life form, right? It's like your own life. Like when you're a child or before, you are in existence, you're nothing, and then your parents, all this other stuff. You're a youngin, you grow up, and this is who you are now. Then you're gonna die, and all this other stuff, and that allows you to get an idea of your essence, of who you are, your identity, and things like that. If you didn't have that, you just thought you are who you are now, and that's it. Then how can you understand, what it means, what you were 10 years ago when you were a child, or what you will be in 20 years when you're like you could be completely somebody completely something completely else. Um, yeah, it's just interesting because that change and that dynamicism, that process of developing, like that process of going through life and going through reality and stuff like that is super important.
If the
I like that.
form is declared to be the same as the essence, then it's a mistake by that very nature to suppose that cognition can be satisfied with the in itself or the essence. What we want is not just some sort of, static, stay the same anchor point. We want to know how that essence actually plays out. Think about a conception like freedom. Now, you can come up with a definition of freedom, and even if you get other people to accept that definition, you need to actually have examples. You need to be able to talk about the development of freedom in time, in history, in situations.
This is even better. Like, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, but this is an even better, way of thinking about this idea. A chair, identity, your life. These are ideas that you can kind of be like, okay, this is what it is. But the idea of freedom, right? The idea of property, the idea of money, and all this other stuff. These are ideas which are inherently abstract. Like there's no, you can't just point to the thing that says that is freedom, right? It only exists in our minds. There's so many aspects of our society, like the word society itself, the idea of society, the idea of civilization. All these things only really exist in the mind, and we can't really point to a thing like we can a chair and we say that's what it is. So if you say the essence of freedom is freedom, like the freedom is freedom, right? We all know what freedom is. No, we don't, right? You and I will probably have different definitions of freedom, and we have to kind of work to get a shared understanding of that. And if we do have different definitions, you have to wonder why. Like, what made you think of that definition of freedom? What made me think of that? And that is so very important, especially today in America, where we're worrying about surveillance, surveillance capitalism. We're worried about the government doing all this and that and the other. We're worried about all these legal rights, which is the same thing as the government, stuff like that. We're worried about the rights of corporations, whatever. All this stuff impacts the idea of freedom, and I'm just super excited about this because I've also been reading about anarchy. So, and reading about anarchy, you begin to see like how the idea of freedom itself has changed over time, and that really shows a lot about why we are where we are. Because a lot of Americans today say, "Oh yeah, we're the most free we've ever been," but if you talk to somebody, couple hundred years ago or a couple thousand years ago, they look at us and be like, "That's not free," right? They would not think of our society as free, because a couple thousand years ago, and especially in hunter-gatherer societies or things like that, they were truly free. They could go anywhere, do anything, they could, whatever. Um, and the fact that we kind of give up a lot of those freedoms in the name of civilization, shows us this change of what we deem as freedom. And that's so if you are not capable of understanding and realizing the dynamics of words and ideas like freedom or property or whatever, then you don't really you can't really talk about them very well, especially when it comes to trying to advocate for certain rights or whatever. So yeah, this is pretty cool.
Really makes sense for one to say, yes, you have grasped the essence of it. The essence is not a verbal formula for Hegel. So he says that thought can't really be happy with the in itself or the essence, but getting along without the form. The absolute principle or absolute intuition makes the working out of this integral to the very process. So if we're talking about divine cognition, not just human cognition, but divine cognition, it's going to incorporate this process, this circular, actually cyclodal process of getting closer and closer and closer to what's really essential. Stripping things away, adding things in, incorporating things.
It's asymptotic.
That's the process of the dialectic. That's what he's describing here. So he says, only then, when we actually think of things in terms of the wealth of form, only then is the absolute conceived and expressed as an actuality. Now, he is talking about things other than the absolute, because those are all parts for Hegel of the absolute. They're all moments within the absolute. But he's also talking about the entirety, the whole. So he's carrying out a kind of logical analysis here.
Logical analysis, let's go.
The true is the whole, but the whole is nothing other than the essence consummating itself through its development. Of the absolute, it must be said that it is essentially a result, that only in the end is it what it truly is, and that precisely in this consists its nature, that is, to be actual, subject, the spontaneous becoming of itself. Though it may seem contradictory that the absolute should be conceived essentially as a result, it needs little pondering to set this show of contradiction in its true light. The beginning, the principle, or the absolute, is at first immediately enunciated. It is only the universal.
So let's break that down a little bit. The true is the whole, but the whole is nothing other than the essence consummating itself through its development. Meaning, if you want to explain like a whole, like he was saying, you have to kind of, be able to explain it as you go. You have to kind of break it down and understand the process of it. And in doing so, then you can get a full idea of what is the truth and what is the whole. At least that's how I'm saying it. Of the absolute, it must be said that it is essentially a result that only in the end is what it truly is. Yeah, you don't really, like we were saying before, you're setting up those tools. Like, if you want to get the idea of the absolute, then you have to go through the entire process of everything. It becomes kind of self-referential, or becomes, you go full circle with explaining itself by messing around with the negation, with the opposite, with the other, and all this other stuff, seeing what it is, what it's not, and then by understanding what it's not, you can better understand what it is, right? And that's how you go that full circle there. You're saying, okay, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that, so it's probably this, right? And then you say, okay, what's this? It's not that, it's not that. And that's how you go in that cycle. So that's how you understand its nature. It is to be actual subject, spontaneous becoming on itself.
Precisely in this consists its nature, that is, though it may seem contradictory that the
absolute should be conceived essentially as a result, it needs little pondering to set this show of contradiction in its true light. The beginning, the principle, or the absolute, as at first immediately enunciated, is only the universal. Yeah, so it seems contradictory to say, oh, you can break down the absolute and the whole, or everything else by looking at these different aspects of it, but it becomes self-evident because in order to understand what you're in, you have to be able to look around. You have to be able to see that you're in something, right? You're a part of something, or you have to experience alienation, right? And that's interesting, too, because that goes into the idea of consciousness itself being a form of othering. Like, I'm not sure if many other animals realize, that they're in a world and that they're a separate being from that world, right? Like, we see this with children as they grow older. Um, a baby kind of just cries because they think everything is themselves, like everything is connected, and they cry because it's like, oh, why am I not comfortable? Everything we like, it's your own body. Like, if you're hungry, you're hungry because you feel hungry, then you go and get some food. But for a baby, they don't know what's the idea of you and them and that. But so if it's hungry, it just expects to be fed, right? But it can't physically get up, so it's looking at other elements to go and get it. And especially you especially see that as a toddler, right? You especially see that with toddlers who begin to realize that they are themselves. They look in the mirror and they're like, oh wow, that's a separate person, or like, I am that person, right? Versus, at first something may look in the mirror, they don't really understand what's going on there. But at a certain age, they begin to look in the mirror, and then they see themselves. They realize that this is themselves, right? But they don't quite realize that, at different levels, you may not realize that, or the child may not realize that the adult is a separate entity from themselves. So when they feel hungry or they want something, they don't understand why the adult doesn't know. Like, you should read my mind, right? They have that understanding of, what's going on in my head, because there is no difference. There's no alienation yet between my head and your head. It's just, there's this assumption that there's a shared, mind. And so therefore, if I'm hungry, it's like, we're hungry. Why are we not eating yet? And that's why they get angry and stuff like that, or at least fussy. But at a certain age, you begin to realize, oh, I am me. I am separate than my parent or the other person, and it's a process of alienation. And in so doing, you begin to gain your own identity, right? And I think that's a similar process that's going on here with the ideas of truth, and when you're messing around with ideas and the divine or whatnot. So that's crazy.
Absolute should be conceived essentially as a result. It needs little pondering to set this show of contradiction in its true light. The beginning, the principle, or the absolute, is at first immediately enunciated. It is only the universal. Just as when I say all animals, this expression cannot pass for a zoology, so it is equally plain that the words the divine, the absolute, the eternal, etc., do not express what is contained in them, and only such words, in fact, do express the intuition as something immediate. Whatever is more than such a word, even the transition to a mere proposition, contains a becoming other that has to be taken back, or is a mediation. But it is just this that is rejected with horror, as if absolute cognition were being surrendered, when more is made of mediation than in simply saying that it is nothing absolute and is completely absent in the absolute.
That's interesting. So I'm interested with how Sadler would take this, but yeah, like the idea of, oh, all animals are this. This is an animal. All animals are this. Like, that's obviously, if people said that, like if a biologist said that, you'd be like, what are you talking about? All animals don't behave the same way. Obviously, some animals do this, some animals do that, some other animals do that, right? And then the whole definition of what is an animal, right, versus an insect versus a tree, right? You can't just point to a tree and say that's like all animals. It's a life form. Like, no, obviously it's not. We separate these things for a reason, right? Because they behave differently and all this other stuff. But it seems like with philosophy, especially with the ideas of divine, of God, right? We begin to think that, all divine is the same. Everything here is divine, or this consciousness or whatever, right? But we don't realize that the similarities there with saying it's the same thing as saying, oh, all animals do this. The idea of the absolute, the divine, of God, if you will, I think has to incorporate the othering, or realizing what it is and what it's not, and what's different in these different behaviors, and how it reacts differently in different environments, and this, that, and the other, right? Is this a lot more complexity to it, and so understanding that, you can better understand what you're actually talking about. Um, but let's see how he takes this here.
Paragraph 20 is one of these where he's drawing some threads together and tying them in a knot and getting us ready to move on to some new ideas. So he talks about the true, and he says the true is the whole. And then we want to ask, well, what the hell does that mean? The true is the whole. It's one thing to talk in terms of like, well, you got to grasp things holistically and take everything in. For Hegel, it's not just going to be, well, you don't want to leave anything out. It's rather, when we ask this question, how is the truth the whole? It's a question of essence, as he says, consummating itself through development. Now, I wrote a couple other words under this consummating because I want us to think in terms of a few other related concepts that are connected with this, both in Hegel's thought and also in more, the tradition that he's working off of. To talk about something consummating itself, particularly to talk about an essence consummating itself, what does that mean? I've brought this up in other places. Aristotle in the Politics talks about the physis, the nature of a thing, and he says, well, the nature of a thing is what that thing is when it's fully developed, when it's fully unfolded, when it's been brought to its perfection. And this is very similar to what Hegel's talking about. So a human being, for example, or a horse is less complex than a human being because it's not a rational animal. Reason doesn't, make things simpler. It actually complicates the hell out of things. Including what kind of beings we are, because only rational beings actually ask, what kind of being am I? What is my essence? That's something that has to be worked out, that has to be, and these emphasize different sort of aspects of it, unfolded. When you unfold something, you're pulling something out of it. You're finding the recesses of it and bringing them to light. So that sort of puts the stress on the activity there. The perfecting. What is the goal? What is the end? What is the finished state that we're talking about here, that the things tend towards through their processes of development, provided the development is going the right way? That's what we're focused on here. That's how the true is the whole, because the whole ends up being consummated through this very complex process of development that's going to take place through all of human history, all of human culture, coming to a culmination in, of course, Hegel. We might want to, say he might have been a little optimistic about that, but let's see where he's going. So he says, the nature of the absolute is to be actual, to be subject, that to be the spontaneous becoming of itself. And he says, it may seem contradictory that the absolute should be conceived as a result rather than being just the starting point. But the absolute is something that actually has to develop over time. And now he's going to make an analogy here, a really interesting one. And he's going to make a number of different analogies that lead us into some you might call actually logical exercises that show us what we're supposed to be grasping here. So he says, when I say all animals, this doesn't pass for zoology. Similarly, when I use words like the divine, the absolute, the eternal, they don't actually express what's contained in them. We have to unfold or unpack what's actually in those. It's not evident from the start what exactly they comprise, and our initial ideas about it may turn out, and generally in Hegel's case, do turn out to be mistaken, turn out to be starting points that we have to surpass and surpass and surpass, and also sort of bring along with us. So he says, whatever is more than such a word, even the transition to a mere proposition, contains a becoming other. So as soon as we start saying something like the absolute, we can pick predicates that we want to say in it. What does the absolute mean? The absolute, let's say we say, develops. Here we have a subject, here we have a predicate. Already this term develops is starting to sort of color our notion of the absolute. We now have additional information. Now you could say, well, the whole idea of develops was contained in the absolute, if you can see that from the start. Just like, Thomas Aquinas said, if you really understand what the term God means, you'll see that necessary being is already sort of packed in there. He says this, by the way, in the commentary on the Psalms.
I don't know who that is, but okay.
Hegel would say, look, when you're doing that, the predicate is modifying the way in which you see the subject. It's actually making it more concrete, more rich. It's no longer just this abstract thing. So he says, what's going on here is the process of becoming other. The predicate mediates the subject mediates the predicate. They actually develop. The development develops. And then he says, a lot of people don't like that. He says, this is a mediation. And he says, it's just this that is rejected with horror, as if absolute cognition were being surrendered whenever more is made of mediation than simply saying it's nothing absolute and completely absent in the absolute. Mediation is going to be integrally present, unavoidable, in the very, not just concept, but the very reality of the absolute. And its process of development is going to take place through a number of different mediations.
That's awesome. I kind of missed that last part a little bit. When he was talking about unfolding, like I was thinking of the whole analogy with the animals. That's like being able to explain how you look at it in different ways. Back to what he was saying with the different diversities and stuff like that. But that is a great point. Obviously it's a great point. That's why he's writing this. But the idea that if we try to explain, to us today, I don't think anybody, at least to my knowledge, really talks about the absolute or the universal and stuff like that. We kind of gotten beyond that to an extent, but there's still plenty of people who see the world from this from the perspective of, let's say, a religious concept of God, right? God explains everything. We are, the the part of God, whatever, blah blah blah. We are His creations and stuff like that. But then you say, okay, but what is God? If you just say God is God, okay, that doesn't really explain anything. You say, okay, just like you would say animals. Okay, we say, what is animals? Like, just saying animals doesn't really explain to you what animals are. You have to break it down to saying, okay, this is an animal, that is an animal. An animal does this. This is the behavior of an animal. Even if you want to go beyond that or bigger than that, you say life. Right? What is life? Again, you can't just say life is life. You have to say, okay, life is a thing that is not dead. It's a this, that, and the other. It does this, it does that. You have to break it down to understand what it is. And by breaking it down, you're kind of othering it, right? You're alienating the idea. You're saying, okay, there's things that's life and there's things that's not life, right? There's things that make up life. There's things that life does, or that different things that are living do, right? And just the idea that, okay, you can't say things that have life. You say things that are living, that are in the process of being alive, right? So that gives you a better understanding of what life is, but it also alienates the idea of what life in general is as a concept. And so the same thing you have to do with God. Is like, and that seems as blasphemy to people. I know I was raised in a Seventh-day Adventist, community for much of my adolescence, and people don't like you questioning this sort of thing. They say you do, like, oh yeah, it's good that you question, but when you go too far, you're like, oh, that's blasphemy. You can't do that. All these young people, you can't, blah 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 blah, right? And so that makes you it's a let me not get into that. Let me not get. Obviously, it's problematic, but that is the problem with kind of just saying, "Oh, it is what it is," and not really getting into the deeper aspects of it. You can even apply this, I think, to other ideas, like once again, economy. Like, what is economy? What is the economy? What is economics? Right? You have to break it down. You can't just say, economy is this. Is economy? You have to say, okay, what it's not. What it is, how it acts, what are the different behaviors within it, what are the different aspects of it, and by doing so, you can better explain what it is you're trying to talk about. And then we get to, like, I love what Sadler said before, the idea of freedom, right? That's super prescient right now. Um, and so when we talk about freedom, we have to think about what is not freedom, right? What is freedom? Why is freedom so important to people? All these other things. The idea that oh, freedom is self-evident is kind of silly because it's not. Like, you might think it is, you might want it to be, but the fact that we may have different definitions of freedom shows you that it's not self-evident. You have to explain it. You have to, you know, break it down. You have to understand what it is you're trying to accomplish. But anyways, yeah, I really like this chapter or these sections. I might have to go through this faster because I'm super curious now to get into the actual thing of what he's saying here. I'm not sure how long the preface is, um, but I don't know how I'll go faster though. Maybe if I do a video every day, I might be able to do that for the next couple of days. Maybe I'll try to do that next week. We'll see. Because I'm really excited to get into the preface now, and I want to maintain this kind of process. Because if I go and try to read it myself, and then come back and watch these videos, I'm not sure if I'm going to do that because I rarely ever reread things. I almost never reread books. Maybe that's my problem. I should probably do that, but there's so many stuff to read. Like by the time I read it once, I can go read a whole bunch of other books, and they say, yeah, you learn something new when you reread something. But I like to wait a couple years before I reread, if I even think about rereading. So I don't know. But yeah, this was great. And once again, thank you for watching with me. If you have your own ideas, I would love to know what you got from this. And again, once again, like I said in the beginning, what were your interpretations of these couple of sections when you were reading, if you remember that? Or if you're watching and reading alongside me, what are some of the things that you were thinking about? And how did it differ from what I was thinking, from what Sadler was thinking, and from what Hegel was saying? I would love to see that dialectics in action and see how different people are taking different things away from this. But yeah, as always, thanks for watching.